I'm going to talk about hospitality this morning. Entertaining guests has not always come easily to me. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because I'm an introvert. And when my husband, who's an extrovert, will say to me, "Hey, let's invite so-and-so over for dinner in a few hours." I'm thinking, can't you see I'm reading a book? Or maybe it's because I tend to be a perfectionist and I want my house to be tidy and clean before anybody comes over. It could be that I just have this idea that hospitality is just not one of my gifts. It's just not one of my spiritual gifts. There certainly are people that are gifted in hospitality. They have the ability to strike up a conversation with anyone, anywhere, like my husband. Their doors are always open to strangers and friends alike. Now, how many of you are like that? Come on, raise those hands high, because I don't have anything planned for lunch. And no, I'm just kidding. As Christians, we are to extend hospitality to others. It's not an option. It's not the responsibility of a committee at church. It's not the responsibility of just those Christians who are extroverts. We all have that responsibility. Now, when we come to church, it's human nature to seek out our friends or people that are like us and to chat with them. But as Christians, we're supposed to seek out the lost, those who don't know Christ, or those who truly are just lost in the building and would like to know where the restroom is. Today, I want us to consider the example of hospitality in the life of Abraham. You know, Father Abraham had many sons. Yeah, well, I've sung that a lot with kids over the years. If you're not familiar with that song or with the person of Abraham, Abraham is a big deal in Scripture. His story is found in the book of Genesis. He's also referenced in the New Testament as a man of great faith. He trusted God, he walked close to God, even when he couldn't figure out what God was doing. He was a faithful man. But as great as Abraham was, he was humble enough to be a wonderful example of hospitality. So this story is found in Genesis 18. The Lord appeared again to Abraham. So already we know that he's close to God. God and Abraham have already had some contact. But the Lord appeared again to Abraham near the oak grove belonging to Mamre. One day, Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent during the hottest part of the day. He looked up and noticed 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he ran to meet them and welcomed them, bowing low to the ground. Now, in that time, it was really dangerous to be a traveler. If someone didn't extend hospitality to you as a traveler, you could just die in the heat of the day, or many other bad things could happen to you. If strangers showed up at your tent, you were obligated to help them. The travelers would stand at a distance and see if the person in the tent was going to be a host or not. Now, Abraham actually ran out to meet them and bowed down to show that he wasn't a threat. He wanted to host them. I don't think at that point that Abraham realizes that God has come to dinner. I think he doesn't recognize God in the visitors. And the next part, he says, "My Lord," and Lord is not capital. It's kind of like sir. So he doesn't quite realize it yet. "My Lord," he said, "if it pleases you, stop here for a while. And since you've honored your servant with this visit, let me prepare some food to refresh you before you continue on your journey." If you're a first-time guest with us today, or if you're fairly new to this church, we want to welcome you. We're honored by your presence with us. You had a lot of choices today, and you chose to come and worship, and we're so glad that you did. "All right," they said, "do as you have said." So Abraham ran back to the tent and said to Sarah, "Hurry, get 3 large measures of your best flour, knead it into dough, and bake some bread." Then Abraham ran out to the herd and chose a tender calf and gave it to his servant, who quickly prepared it. When the food was ready, Abraham took some yogurt and milk and the roasted meat, and he served it to the men. As they ate, Abraham waited on them in the shade of the trees. We are to give our best to our guests in our home and in our church. There's a book called The Race to Reach Out, and there's a quote from it. Hospitality demands that we offer our best gifts to our guests. Do our gifts to our first-time guests in our church include our best welcome or just a perfunctory handshake? Do we offer open conversation or the curt greetings given to someone boarding an airplane? Do we share the best seats in our churches or the leftover ones in the back row of the balcony where you cannot see the preacher? Now, let's just stop there for a minute, because in the United Methodist Church, we know the favorite seat is in the back. And if you're too late, you have to sit closer to the front. Nobody wants to do that. But, it could be hospitality if those of us who've been here for a long time sat a little closer to the front and left those back seats open for newcomers so they could have the safety of the back of the room. Hospitality urges us to offer our best gifts to our treasured guests. It's a good thing Abraham offered his best to his guests, because it turned out that he was entertaining God. I don't think he realized it until the strangers asked about his wife. "Where is Sarah, your wife?" the visitors asked. "She's inside the tent," Abraham replied. Now, I don't think strangers would have known what his wife's name was. And especially since God had recently changed her name to Sarah. So, even if you were local, maybe you wouldn't know that. So I think that's when Abraham realized God had come to dinner. Now, what are the odds that God's going to come to dinner at our house or at our church? What are the odds? Pretty good. Pretty good odds that God is going to show up. Because Jesus said, "For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home. I tell you the truth, when you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me." Taking care of others is taking care of Jesus. Whatever care and compassion we would show to Jesus should be what we show to others. And not just at church, but everywhere. When we leave this building, I want us to remember that the responsibility for hospitality goes with us. Whatever way we treat others is how we're treating Jesus. Last week, Pastor Drew spoke of walls that we sometimes build in between us. We can unintentionally put up a wall by our actions and words in our daily lives. We should be representing God at all times, everywhere we go. Hospitality cannot just be pulled out on Sunday morning and shelved the rest of the week. That kind of attitude could keep people from coming into this building. You can't fix a week of bad behavior by handing somebody a donut on Sunday. You know the saying, charity begins at home? Well, hospitality begins out there, outside the walls of this building. We share the love of Christ with others. And then that continues when they come here and how we welcome and care for them here. When people do enter this building for the first time, we ought to notice. We ought to notice them. I'm not saying that we have to do what Abraham did and run up and bow down to them. I think that might be a little scary. But remember, that person that walked into these doors for the first time, they had a lot of options. They had a lot of choices what to do on Sunday morning. And they chose to come here. We ought to notice them and welcome them. One woman wrote about how she feels when visiting a church for the first time. She said, "Few situations make me as uncomfortable as being a newcomer at church. Everyone else has somebody to talk to during the coffee hour, and there I stand, awkward and ill at ease, my inner introvert yelling at me to go home and curl up with a book. Now, not only can that coffee time be lonely, but the worship can be lonely too. I read another story about a woman named Ruth who was a greeter, but she wasn't really a greeter. She wasn't officially a greeter. Ruth was 88 years old, and she always sat on the second row left of the center aisle. But she wasn't one of those people that felt like she owned that seat. She never protected it. Instead, she was always asking people to sit with her. One day, a young man named Matt, who was barely 30 years old, came to church for the first time. He was alone, he was unsure, he was looking for a seat. And he heard a voice say, "Young man, are you here alone? Sit right here with me." And at the end of the service, she said to him, "I hope you come back next week. I'll be right here. I'll save a seat for you." And that was enough for Matt. He was home. This was his church. Ruth was his friend. As a young family, my husband and I and our 3-year-old son moved to a new town. And we didn't know anybody there. But we soon found out that our next-door neighbors were a young family like us. And their oldest son and our son hit it off and liked to play together. And the mom next door invited me over, and we sat in her kitchen, and she got me something to drink. And she said, "Now, the first time you're here, I'll get you whatever you need. But from now on, when you come over, you're like family, so just help yourself." That was huge to me. That was her saying, "I want you to come back, and I want you to feel like you're part of us here." Being included is part of hospitality. We all want to belong. And if we continue to treat a guest like a guest, instead of drawing them in, then we're excluding them. That's why it meant so much for me to be told by my neighbor to help myself. It meant that I was no longer on the outside. I was no longer a stranger. Hospitality is me welcoming you to sit at the table and share with me. To share fellowship, stories, food, gifts. If all I do is just give to you and do for you, after a while, you'll feel uncomfortable. You'll feel like I don't care about who you are or what you bring to the table. We want to serve our guests, but we want to be willing to be served by them as well. And this is illustrated in that Genesis passage about Abraham. Abraham pulled out all the stops for his guests, spared no expense, but one of the guests then did something for him. He promised Abraham that he would have a son. It says, "Then one of them said, 'I will return to you about this time next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son.'" Abraham and Sarah were way too old to be having children. That just was like crazy talk. But nothing is too hard for God. And God was promising them a son. And God kept that promise. Hospitality doesn't have to be one-sided. If you're a guest here today, I want to make you feel comfortable. I want to show you where the restrooms are, where the donuts are, but I also want to know who you are and give you the chance to know Jesus if you don't already know him, and to give you a chance to share in his ministry. This is an important thing I want you to know. You don't have to be a member before you serve at this church. You can do many things in this church and not have to be a member. If you're new to this church, we welcome you. You are now eligible to serve. Congratulations. Because everyone has something to bring to the table. Everyone has something to give. All of us are needy and gifted and equal in the eyes of God. When it comes to hospitality, failure is not an option. The church depends on hospitality. It's not a gimmick. It's genuine love and care for all people. This is our task, discovering how the church can be the kind of place that people cannot help but come to each week because they know they'll be welcomed just as they are. Whether inside or outside the walls of this church, let's seek to demonstrate genuine love. Let's see people as loved by God and loved through us.